We've all seen those TV shows with those high-priced defense attorneys wearing those fancy suits. We've seen them in the movies too. Good defense attorneys, experienced ones, the kind who have been getting their clients off for 30 years, who know every procedural trick, every jury psychological technique, every way to muddy the water that looks perfectly clear. And his client's guilty. He knows it. The jury suspects it. The evidence is overwhelming. But he has one argument that he continues to return to over and over and over again every time that the prosecutor lands a punch. My client's a job creator. It doesn't matter what the charge is. It doesn't matter what the evidence shows. Fraud. He's a job creator. Price fixing. He's a job creator. Misleading consumers. He creates jobs. The argument isn't really a defense. It's a deflection. It's designed to make the jury feel like convicting this man would hurt them personally. And Big Pharma has its own version of this argument, and they've been using it for decades. If you touch our prices, if you force us to lower our prices, it will kill innovation. That's it. That's the whole case. Every time someone proposes drug pricing reform, every time a senator asks why Americans pay 3 times what Canadians pay for the exact same pill, every time a patient testifies about rationing insulin, the industry's lawyers and lobbyists lean into the microphone and say, innovation. Do you want to hurt innovation? Well, today we're going to look at what the data actually says about that argument. Not what pharma says, not what the industry's press releases say, the data. Peer-reviewed studies, financial filings, and clinical trial registries. And what the data says is going to surprise you. Welcome back to Bust Big Pharma. I'm Rob Burgess. Today we're going to do something a little different. We're going to take Big Pharma's most powerful argument, the one they wheel out every single time anyone tries to hold them accountable for anything, and we're going to run it through the data. Study by study, number by number, company by company. The argument, as I said in the open, is innovation. The structure of the argument goes like this. Developing new drugs is extraordinarily expensive. It takes years. Most drugs fail. The ones that succeed have to pay for the ones that didn't. So if you limit what we charge, we will have less money to invest in the next generation of treatments. And the patients who would have benefited from those treatments will suffer. So back off. Now, I want to say something important before we go any further. The argument is not entirely wrong, and I acknowledge that. Drug development is genuinely very expensive. It's genuinely risky. It's genuinely important. Nobody serious, nobody on this show is arguing that pharmaceutical innovation doesn't matter or that companies shouldn't be able to earn a return on legitimate research investment. We believe in the American free market. We believe that risk should be rewarded. What we don't believe in is that an argument deserves to be accepted just because it sounds reasonable. When you really look at the numbers, when you examine the financial filings, when you study who is actually doing the innovating, when you look at what high prices actually produce in terms of medical breakthroughs, the industry's story starts to fall apart. Not at the edges, but at its foundation. So let's build the case carefully, because the facts deserve to be presented carefully. And Big Pharma deserves to have their argument answered on the merits, not dismissed, but answered. So here's what we're going to establish today. 1, the 15 largest pharmaceutical companies over a 20-year period spent more money on marketing than they did on research and development. That is a fact drawn from their own financial filings. 2, the prices pharmaceutical companies charge for drugs have no meaningful correlation to how much those drugs cost to develop. That is a finding of a peer-reviewed study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association. 3, the prices pharmaceutical companies charge for cancer drugs have no meaningful correlation to how well those drugs actually work, from the same journal. 4, most genuine pharmaceutical innovation, the actual discovery of new drugs, happens not at the large companies raising prices on old medications, but at small, unprofitable startups. That is the finding of a detailed analysis of a decade of FDA approvals and clinical trial data. 5. When large companies do raise prices and funnel some of that money into their own R&D labs, they are dramatically less productive than the industry average. In one documented case, 45 times less productive. 5 arguments, all sourced, all documented, all drawn from peer-reviewed research or audited financial statements. So let's go. All right, folks, let's start with the number that I think tells you everything you need to know about where Big Pharma's priorities actually lie. Researchers at the BMJ, the British Medical Journal, one of the oldest, most widely respected peer-reviewed medical publications in the world, analyzed the publicly available financial reports of the 15 largest biopharmaceutical companies over a 20-year period. That was 1999 to 2018. 20 years, 15 companies, their own numbers. Total revenues over that period was $7.7 trillion. Amount spent on research and development in that time was $1.4 trillion. The amount spent on selling, general, and administrative activities, which includes marketing, was $2.2 trillion. Let me say that a little bit more simply. Over 20 years, the largest drug companies in the world spent $800 billion more selling their drugs than they did on researching them. $800 billion with a B. Now, I want to anticipate the counter argument because I know it's coming, because the industry has one ready. What they're going to say is selling, general, and administrative costs aren't just marketing. They include legal departments and human resources and accounting and executive compensation and administrative overhead. And that's true. It's a very broad category. But here's the thing. Even if you strip out everything that isn't pure advertising and promotion, and the industry's advertising budgets alone run into the billions of dollars annually, as we've documented in an earlier episode, you are still looking at a company sector that consistently prioritizes commercial activity over scientific activity. The ratios don't lie. But there's more in the same financial filings. BMJ researchers noted that most of these same drug companies also spent more buying back their own stock than they spent on R&D during that same period. Stock buybacks. I mean, folks, we could spend 3 episodes talking about stock buybacks, but for those who aren't familiar, a stock buyback is when a company uses its cash to purchase its own shares on the open market. It doesn't fund research. It doesn't develop new treatment. It increases earnings per share, which makes executive stock-based compensation worth more, and it rewards existing shareholders. So to summarize the financial picture from the industry's own financial books, more money went to selling drugs than discovering them. More money went to enriching the shareholders than to the research labs. And we're supposed to believe that any reduction in prices would devastate innovation? Well, the books tell a different story. But I'm going to even go deeper, because the marketing number, as damning as it is, still leaves room for the industry to argue. Fine, maybe we spend more on marketing than we'd like, but the price of individual drugs is still connected to the cost of developing. Is it? Researchers at the Journal of the American Medical Association asked exactly that question. They examined 63 drugs approved by the FDA between 2009 and 2018. They looked at the estimated research and development costs for every single one of those drugs, and then they looked at what the company charged for that drug when it launched. What they found, and I want to make sure I get this exactly right, there was no association between estimated research and development investments and treatment costs based on list price at the launch of the product or based on net prices a year after launch. No association. So where's the truth? There's not even a weak association here. Not a complicated association. There's no association. So we're being lied to. Think about what that means. If the industry's argument were true, if high prices really were calibrated to recover R&D costs, you would expect to see some relationship between the two. An expensive drug to develop should cost more. A cheaper drug to develop should cost less. That's the story they tell. But that's not what the data tells us. The data shows no connection whatsoever between what it costs to develop a drug and what the company decided to charge for it. So if prices aren't based on development costs, how are they set? And we're going to get to that. We have to get to that. But first, let's look at cancer data, because the cancer numbers are particularly stark. Cancer drugs occupy a special place in this debate, partly because cancer is the disease that most Americans fear most, partly because cancer patients are often the most desperate. They're willing to try anything, pay anything for more time, and partly because cancer drugs are increasingly the most expensive drugs in the entire pharmaceutical market. So the question I want to ask is this: do cancer patients pay more because the drugs that cost more work better? Another Journal of the American Medical Association study, this one published in their internal medicine journal, examined cancer drugs approved by the FDA between 2015 and 2020. The researchers looked at the price of each drug, and then they looked at the clinical evidence. How much did each drug actually improve patient outcomes? Did it extend life? By how much? Did it improve quality of life? Did it slow disease progression at all? And then they asked, is there a relationship between what those drugs cost and how well they actually work? The researchers found, and again, I'm going to be precise here so that I'm not told that I'm juicing the argument. The researchers found that they did not detect a meaningful association between cancer drug prices and the magnitude of clinical benefit of any of the measures they examined. None. A cancer drug that extends life by 6 months costs the same as one that extends life by 6 weeks. A drug that meaningfully improves quality of life isn't priced higher than one with modest effects. There's no premium for performance. There's no discount for underperformance. And the researchers drew the only logical conclusion from this finding. Cancer drugs, they said, are priced based predominantly on what the market will bear. What the market will bear. Not what the research cost, not what the benefit is worth, not what a fair return on investment would require, whatever the traffic will allow. Now sit with that for a moment, because we are not talking about luxury goods here. We're not talking about sports cars or designer watches, where what the market will bear is an entirely appropriate pricing philosophy. We are talking about drugs that cancer patients need to stay alive. A patient with a terminal diagnosis is not a consumer making a rational market choice between competing options. They are a human being who will pay anything, and I mean anything, for a chance at more time. That is not a market in any meaningful sense. That is a captive population. And the data says clearly that the industry knows it and prices accordingly. This is not innovation. It's extraction. All right, so we've established that prices have no connection to R&D costs and no connection to clinical effectiveness, and that more money goes into marketing than into research. But the industry still has one more line of defense, and they use it all the time. It goes like this: fine, maybe our financial ratios aren't perfect, but we are the ones with the resources to run the massive, expensive clinical trials that bring drugs across the finish line. Without us, those drugs never reach patients at all. So you still need us, and you still need our margins. The argument sounds compelling, and it used to be more true than it is today, but the data has shifted, and the picture it now paints is one that the industry lobbying apparatus would very much prefer that you not think about too carefully. The Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity, a center-right think tank, and I want to be clear about that, these are not progressive activists, conducted a detailed review of every new drug approved by the FDA over a 10-year period from 2011 to 2020. They examined who owned the rights to each drug when it entered phase 1 clinical trials. In other words, who discovered it? Who took the initial financial risk on it? Who believed in it enough to start the development process? The finding? In 2020 alone, 60% of new drugs approved by the FDA were first brought into clinical trials by early-stage unprofitable companies. 60%. It wasn't Pfizer. It wasn't Eli Lilly. It was small companies. It was startups. It was pre-revenue biotechs backed by venture capital. Companies that in many cases had never turned a profit. And when you look at the broader R&D pipeline, not just approvals, but everything in development, early stage companies account for 72% of the total pharmaceutical R&D pipeline in 2018. 72%. Coming from companies that the large incumbents would have you believe cannot possibly sustain innovation without high prices flowing through the big corporate labs. Now, why does this happen? Why do small, unprofitable startups out-innovate companies with billions in annual revenue and armies of scientists? The answer isn't mysterious. It's pretty straightforward. At a large pharmaceutical company, a scientist's career depends on not failing. Bureaucracies reward caution. They reward incremental progress. They reward working on established platforms rather than genuinely novel approaches. The incentive structure pushes towards safety. As a startup, a scientist's career and personal financial stake depends entirely on the drug working. If it works, everybody wins. If it doesn't, the company ceases to exist. That is a very different incentive structure. It produces very different risk tolerances, and it produces very different scientific outputs. So here's what actually happens in the pharmaceutical ecosystem, stripped of the lobbying mythology. The genuine breakthroughs happen at small, scrappy, underfunded companies built around a single scientific insight. Those companies take the early risk. They run the initial trials. They prove the concept. And then the large companies, with their enormous balance sheets and their distribution networks and their regulatory expertise, acquire those companies. They buy the innovation that their own labs couldn't produce. And then they use their market power to extract the maximum possible price. That's the system. That's how it actually works, folks. And the implication of that system is significant because if most genuine innovation comes from small, unprofitable startups, companies that are not generating the enormous margins of a company like a Pfizer, then the argument that high prices at large incumbents are necessary to fund innovation is simply not supported by the evidence. The large companies are not primarily the innovators. They are primarily the distributors, the acquirers, and the price setters. And their pricing power is not a reward for scientific risk-taking. It's a function of market dominance. Let's make this concrete, because generalizations are easy to argue with, and specific numbers are not. I'm going to tell you about a drug called Humira. Humira is a treatment for rheumatoid arthritis and related inflammatory diseases. It was launched in the United States in 2003. As of recent years, it is the largest selling drug in the world by annual revenue. Not one of the largest, the largest. And over the decade from 2011 to 2020, $96 billion in net U.S. sales came from Humira alone. $96 billion from a single drug. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Of that $96 billion, researchers analyzed how much came from treating more patients, more people getting the drug, more prescriptions being written, and how much came purely from raising the price. Year after year after year, charging more for the exact same product. Nearly 2/3 of Humira's revenue growth over that decade, about $42 billion, came from price increases. Not helping more patients, not from scientific improvement, but from charging existing patients more. To be exact, $41.7 billion from raising prices on a drug that had not materially changed. Now, the company that owns Humira will tell you that those prices were necessary to fund innovation, that without that additional revenue, they couldn't invest in the next generation of treatments. So let's test the claim. Over that same 10-year period, the parent company spent a total of $39.7 billion on research and development across the entire company. And from all that R&D spending, they developed 6 novel drugs that received FDA approval. 2 for hepatitis C, 1 for leukemia and lymphoma, 1 for psoriasis, and 1 for rheumatoid arthritis, and 1 for migraine prevention. 6 drugs, 10 years. Now let's put that in context. Researchers at the Journal of the American Medical Association found that the median cost of bringing a new drug to market, accounting for failure, is $985 million. Industry-wide. $985 million. The parent company of Humira's cost per novel drug was $6.6 billion, against an industry median of $985 million. Humira's parent company is approximately 7 times less efficient than the average pharmaceutical company at converting research spending into approved drugs. But here's a number that should really stop you cold, guys. Remember, $42 billion of that revenue came from price increases on Humira. Price increases that were justified, they claim, by the need to fund innovation. And those price increases funded R&D that produced 6 drugs over a decade at 7 times the industry cost per approval. What that means is that giving $42 billion in price increase revenue to develop a single additional novel drug at their demonstrated rate of R&D productivity was approximately 45 times less efficient than what an average pharmaceutical company would produce with the same money. 45 times less efficient. 45x. So the next time you hear a pharmaceutical executive say that high prices are necessary to fund innovation, I want you to think about Humira. I want you to think about $42 billion in price increases on that single drug. I want you to think about 6 approved medicines in a decade, and I want you to think about 45 times less productive than average. This is not a defense of innovation. It's a defense of inefficiency paid for on the backs of patients, and it's despicable. So let's pull back a little bit and talk about something that rarely gets discussed in this pricing debate. Because when we talk about pharmaceutical innovation, we tend to assume we're talking about research into the biggest health problems facing most Americans. Heart disease, diabetes, Alzheimer's. The conditions that affect tens of millions of people, the ones that drive the most suffering, the ones where real breakthrough would be the most consequential. But that is increasingly not where pharmaceutical R&D goes. Here's what the data shows. In 2020, 48%, nearly half of all the drugs in phase 3 clinical trials were for orphan diseases. Orphan diseases are diseases affecting fewer than 200,000 people. Rare conditions, sometimes extremely rare. Nearly half the pipeline for conditions that affect 0.5% of the population. And those orphan drugs, despite treating only 0.5% of patients, account for 11% of all U.S. drug spending. So why is this happening? Is it because pharmaceutical companies have a special passion for rare disease patients? Is it altruism? No, it's math. When you develop a drug for a common disease, diabetes or heart disease, the FDA requires large, lengthy, expensive clinical trials. You might need tens of thousands of patients. You might need to run trials for years. The upfront investment is enormous, and if it fails, you lose everything. When you develop a drug for a rare disease, the FDA's Orphan Drug Act allows you to run trials with a fraction of the patients. The required evidence is less burdensome. The trials are cheaper. The financial risk is lower. And when you succeed, you get 7 years of guaranteed market exclusivity on top of whatever patent protection you already have. And here's the other side of the math. Because you are treating a small, desperate patient population with no alternatives, patients and families who will pay virtually anything, you can charge extremely high prices, hundreds and thousands of dollars per year sometimes even over $1 million. Lower R&D costs, guaranteed exclusivity, captive patient population, maximum pricing power. From a pure business standpoint, it is a near perfect business model. And the comparison between 2 real drugs makes this vivid. Sanofi, the French pharmaceutical company, spent years and an estimated $1.4 billion trying to develop a new oral diabetes drug. They ran 13 phase 3 trials involving nearly 17,000 patients, trying to address a disease that affects over 100 million Americans. The drug ultimately didn't prove superior to existing treatment, so Sanofi walked away. Meanwhile, a company called Spark Therapeutics developed a gene therapy for a rare form of blindness. Their entire phase 3 trial enrolled 31 patients. Their entire R&D budget for the year was $46 million. The drug worked, and they priced it at $850,000 per treatment. $850,000. Spark was later acquired by Roche for $4.8 billion, more than 100 times their annual R&D spend. Now, I'm not saying Spark did anything wrong. They took a real risk. They achieved a real breakthrough. Their investors are entitled to a real return. What I am saying is the financial incentives of the current system are actively steering pharmaceutical R&D away from the biggest public health problems and toward the highest margin niche markets. Not because researchers don't care about diabetes and heart disease, because the financial model of the current system makes it extremely unattractive to try. And the reason those incentives are structured this way, the reason the orphan drug math works out so favorably, is precisely because prices are not constrained by anything other than what the market will bear. In other words, the very pricing freedom that the industry claims is necessary to fund innovation is, in large part, what is steering innovation away from the diseases that affect the most Americans. This isn't a talking point. This is a documented pattern in the data, in the trial registries, in the financial filings. We're being lied to. So if high prices at large pharmaceutical companies don't drive innovation, what does? This is the question the industry hopes you never ask, because the answer is extremely inconvenient for them. The answer, based on the research, is lower costs. Not lower prices, lower costs, specifically lower research and development costs. Think about that. The core financial risk of drug development is not the potential revenue. It's the upfront costs of clinical trials. Those costs are what kill drugs before they reach patients. Those costs are what make investors walk away from promising science. Those costs are what push companies toward rare disease research and away from diabetes and heart disease. 90% of the cost of bringing a drug to market is consumed in phase 3 trials. 90%. So the most powerful lever for increasing pharmaceutical innovation is not giving large incumbents more pricing freedom to generate bigger margins. It is finding a way to make the clinical trial process less expensive, less burdensome, and more accessible to the small companies where most genuine innovation actually originates. The FDA has a model for how this can work. In the 1980s, after a lot of sustained pressure from AIDS activists who were watching people die, waiting for regulatory approval, the FDA began allowing drugs for terminal diseases to conditionally reach the market after phase 2 studies, before the expensive phase 3 trials were complete. Sponsors were still required to finish the longer trials, but they could begin treating patients while doing so. If the phase 3 results didn't replicate the phase 2 findings, the drug would be pulled from the market. That policy change turbocharged innovation for AIDS and cancer dramatically because it cut the financial risk of developing those drugs. It brought the cost down for the manufacturers, and the lower cost brought in more research, more competition, and more breakthroughs. That is a model that can be expanded. Applied to metabolic diseases, cardiovascular conditions, neurological disorders, the big public health problems where the trials are most expensive and where the industry's incentives currently push them away. That is a conservative market-based solution, and it doesn't require price controls. It doesn't require government negotiating of every drug. It requires smart regulatory reform that reduces the cost of bringing genuinely valuable medicines to patients, which creates space for competition, which drives prices down. Ladies and gentlemen, here's another piece that you need to know, and we need to be honest about where the foundational science for most pharmaceutical breakthroughs actually come from. It comes from the National Institutes of Health, from university research labs, from publicly funded basic science. One analysis found that U.S. taxpayer funding contributed to research related to every one of the 210 drugs approved by the FDA between 2010 and 2016. Every single drug. The NIH spends roughly $40 billion a year on biomedical research. That is the upstream investment that makes the downstream drug development possible. The public takes the first risk. You take the first risk. The American taxpayer takes the first risk. The companies take the later commercial risk. And then the companies use patent protection and pricing power to extract maximum returns from a public investment they did not make. Society pays twice. Once through taxes funding the basic research, and once through drug prices that are unconstrained by any connection to clinical value or development costs. That is not a free market. That is a system that privatizes gains built on the back of public investment. And that is a problem that conservatives who believe in genuine market integrity should be just as concerned about as anyone else. Now, I want to give pharma their best shot because I believe in being fair, and because their argument, when stated honestly, deserves an honest answer. Pharma, the pharmaceutical industry's principal trade group, has heard all of these arguments, and they have responses. Their response to the marketing over R&D numbers. The period studied is outdated. R&D spending has increased significantly in recent years. The industry is investing more in science than ever before. Fair. R&D spending has increased. We can acknowledge that. But here's the problem with that response. More R&D spending by large incumbents does not automatically mean more innovation. We just showed that. These companies can spend enormous sums and produce dramatically below average results. Spending more money in an inefficient system doesn't fix the system. It just burns more money. Their response to orphan drug data? We develop orphan drugs because patients with rare diseases deserve treatment too. That is not exploitation, it's compassion. Again, fair point. To a degree, rare disease patients do deserve treatment. Nobody's arguing otherwise. But that response doesn't address the structural argument. The question isn't whether companies should develop orphan drugs. The question is whether the current financial incentive structure is consciously steering R&D away from common diseases and toward ultra-high-priced niche drugs. Because the margin math for rare diseases is so much more favorable. The data says this is true. That's not compassion. That is business decisions dressed in the language of compassion. Their response to the no correlation between the price and effectiveness finding? Drug pricing is complex. You can't reduce the value of a treatment to a single efficacy endpoint. That is a sophisticated sounding argument, and it falls apart the moment you put it under a magnifying glass. Because the researchers didn't use a single measure. They looked at multiple clinical endpoints: overall survival, progression-free survival, response rates, quality of life measures. And across all of them, there was no meaningful correlation with price. The conclusion is not an artifact of methodology. It is robust across all the data. And finally, pharma, their response to everything, their closing argument, the one they always return to. Without the profit incentive, the next breakthrough never happens. This is what our answer should be to that. Profit incentive is not the problem. Profit incentive is essential. What the data shows is that the profit incentive as currently structured is not producing what the industry claims it produces. It is producing marketing spend, stock buybacks, orphan drug pivots, acquisition of startup science, and pricing based on what desperate patients are willing to pay, not on what the research costs or what the drug is worth. You can defend profit, or you can defend this specific system, but you can't defend both by pretending that they're the same thing, because they're not. Now I'm going to close with something simple: the innovation argument. The argument that high prices are the price of progress. It's the most powerful tool Big Pharma has. It's the argument that has stopped reform for decades. It is the argument that makes legislators flinch in Washington, D.C. It is the argument that makes ordinary Americans hesitate, wondering, what if they're right? What if pushing back on drug prices really does mean fewer cures? I understand the hesitation. I too hesitated. I took it seriously. And then I looked at the data. The data says that the 15 largest drug companies spent more on marketing than they did on research for 20 years. The data says drug prices have no connection to what the drugs cost to develop. The data says cancer drug prices have no connection to how well cancer drugs actually work. The data says most genuine innovation comes from small, unprofitable startups, not from large companies running the ads and the lobbying campaigns. And the data says when large companies do funnel price increase revenue into their own R&D labs, they produce, in documented cases, results that are 45 times less efficient than the industry average. This is not an innovation system. This is a pricing system with an innovation story attached to it. And the American people, you who are listening, you who are paying the highest drug prices in the developed world, who are rationing prescriptions, who are choosing between medication and groceries, you deserve to know what the data actually shows. The innovation argument is not a fact. It is a defense. And like any defense, it deserves to be examined on the merits. We examined it. By the numbers, it doesn't hold up. This is Bust Big Pharma. I'm Rob Burgess. We'll be back next week.